Guys, I'm very honored to have Nick Mulder as my guest today. And for all of you living in Berlin, Nick went through the whole cycle of self-founded entrepreneur, startupper with the roots and execution, and he has a lot of knowledge to share with us. And I was very happy to bring him in, although we kind of build this podcast from engineers to engineers. But if I look back, Nick was an engineer himself. I managed to look up at his educational background, and his very early educational steps were done with SQL, Hadoop, distributed computation, Python, and then he discovered his true passion. He actually executed that and became entrepreneur in Berlin. But Nick, please introduce yourself. How you normally do this in a party?
At a party. Oh, that's always a good one. So it's funny that you mentioned the whole Hadoop uh, education, because that's actually something that I've almost forgotten. It seems so far away. So I would say I introduced myself as an entrepreneur. So my name is Nick. I grew up in the US, in the States. I was fortunate to go to an international school there. But my passion was always in professional cycling. So much to my parents' dismay, I decided to go down that path. So I moved to the Netherlands when I was 17 or 18 and tried to focus on becoming a professional cyclist. And that was my goal for life. But at the same time, I did go to university in Maastricht, so in the south of the Netherlands, where I chose that rather strategically because it's perfect for cycling. So it's the only part of Holland that's not extremely flat. So it's actually very enjoyable to live there because you're kind of sandwiched between Belgium and Germany, and you have a lot of hills and great cycling routes.
Nick, many engineers follow their passion and remain true to technology. What you've done, you've done remarkable things, and following your, heart. After being a pro cyclist, you founded a company called Fito.app, so it was like a fitness app, and then you also work at 8Fit, so it's also like sport. Then you transition to more holistic health startup, Ada Health. They were like also on the forefront, or like one of the first AI company that I remember in Berlin that were looking into longevity and ability to basically predict some health issues and describe people like what is going on with them. And then you transition to totally different thing, but very important to all of us is basically ability to stay financially dependent, take a conscious decision, answer hard life questions to rent or to buy. And you've built one of the best user-centric startups in Berlin that I actually use myself. So the first one is HippoFriend, and then followed up with Pension Friend. And I would love you to walk us through these milestones. Like, how did you transition from being a sports cyclist, like a professional cyclist, towards financial independence and freedom?
Yeah, sure. So that's a long journey. I think that's almost a decade ago. So as I mentioned before, I moved to the Netherlands to be a cyclist, and at the same time, I did study finance. Um, but even as a cyclist, I was very much obsessed with numbers and analytics. And around that time, I think it was 2009, the first power meter came out, and that was a way to measure the output you would do on a bicycle. And the first software, it was called Training Peaks, came out, and it would allow you to model your training stress and to plan your season based on heavy loads of training and then followed by lower loads of training. And it was really a scientific approach to training, and this was something that was completely new, and it really fascinated me to the point that maybe it became too much of an obsession, and I got so obsessed with the numbers that I kind of forgot about the whole point of racing was to win bike races. So in the end, what I learned was I was very good with analytics and numbers, but I was not actually so good during the races. And eventually, at I think 22, 23, I decided to stop and pursue my master's. which was in the data science BI space. But like every cyclist, I faced another problem, which was this classic huge legs, very skinny upper body problem. So I was like literally lopsided. And that's something that I wanted to change. And showing up at the gym, I realized I didn't know very much about the gym. But again, when I was in the gym, I saw a new problem, which was I need to track my training. So I had this extremely crazy tracking system from cycling, and then I went to the gym and I realized, okay, most people are using pen and paper, and that's when the idea for Fido was born. So Fido allowed you to basically drag and drop workouts. It had a database or a first library of workouts, not like the fancy stuff these days, but rather just a simple, imagine almost like an Excel sheet on your phone with a nice graph to visualize your progress as you got better. So with this, I actually we didn't end up, making it a huge success, but it was for me my first real entrepreneurial foray, like foray into kind of the design and engineering space, and that's actually how I decided, or how I got closer to product management, being on the business, design, engineering kind of space, and being stuck in the middle, so to say, and that's how the passion for building was really born, and that's how I could kind of go from this cycling obsession, and also what was probably one of the big, like say, the deepest failures for me personally at the time, because I spent six years chasing this dream, traveling around the world, and it was a great way for me to funnel this energy into something new, which was, at the time I felt very dark about it, but it was a way to actually, have some hope at the end of the tunnel, so to say. So that was it was some dark times, but also um, a nice way to transition into something meaningful. So that was how I started building, and then not much longer, I was recruited at university by Zalando, who were looking for a product manager to start working. It was actually even a traineeship, so I thought, hey, why not go to Berlin for 2 years and see what this is all about? This shoe startup. Knew nothing about it, but it seemed interesting. New problem to solve, as the whole kind of fitness topic was more of a side project that we grew, and kind of sold off for parts in the end. But it was a good experience to get into the whole building. So I think I'm very happy and grateful for that experience, because it led me to Berlin.
Nick, before we jump into the, like your actual final baby that, we all know right now on the market, I'm curious, being a professional sportsman or athlete, what gave you out of the sport time, or what helped you, or what remained out of the sport that now helps you to be entrepreneur?
Yeah, I mean, cycling, I still believe, is one of the hardest sports out there, and um, like most endurance sports, not to compare or speak badly of other sports, but I think the benefit, and that's why I wouldn't necessarily categorize all sports as the same. But I think one of the takeaways from cycling and endurance sports is really this ability to suffer, and you're really able to kind of mind over body, put your body through excruciating pain. So we would have races that were 10 days long. That was the longest race, 200 kilometers a day, through hills, rain, everything, 6-7 hours on the bike every day. Not every day, but the longest races were 7 hours. And then, after sitting on a saddle for a week or 9 days, it's really not so comfortable anymore. And then you have pain from every part of your body. It's aching every single place. And the only thing you tell yourself is to keep going. So I think that resilience, setbacks. So I had a number of setbacks. I broke a number of bones. I got hit by a car, together with my friend and training buddy who later on became world champion and got second at the Tour de France. He narrowly missed it. I got hit, broke my collarbone the week before we were supposed to go to Mallorca. So a number of setbacks, and you keep telling yourself to keep going. And I think that's very much like entrepreneurship, where especially when you're trying to figure out product market fit, you get negative reviews, you get people who, they might not understand what you're building. They see a part of it, they judge it, they say, hey, it's rubbish. So you're constantly suffering, I think, and you're constantly jumping from setback to setback. So you're really just trying to you have some vision and some direction you want to go towards, and that's also, to be fair, it was also, and it is something that I think can also be negative. So you need to have this North Star and this vision that you're going towards, whether it's, hey, I want to win this race, or hey, I want to achieve this startup goal or metric. But at the same time, life is about more than metrics. And I think what's really important, and took me a lot longer to realize, is that it's also about just enjoying the ride. So that's something that I didn't really do when I was a cyclist. I was always looking at my screen, looking at my numbers, my outputs. So I wasn't looking around to look and see the beautiful trees and landscapes as much. So I think that's something I would say has it's about finding that balance between that crazy ambition level and being able to have that resilience and getting through everything, and then on the other hand also enjoying the journey. And that's maybe something to talk about building a company and the highs and lows. But I think if you're constantly focused on that next high, you will never be happy, because there's always something bigger and better out there.
Yeah, it's extreme. Like, while you were telling me this whole story of being punched in the face so many times that eventually you start enjoying the taste of your blood. Like, I don't know who described it. I think Andreessen Horowitz or someone else.
Mm.
But, and then you mentioned extremely important thought that we should not forget to bring people with us on that ride. I mean,
Yeah,
only then we would truly enjoy the journey. If it's not going to be like a solitary journey, but rather companionship. But
there's actually a great quote, which is, I think, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think that's a nice one, because it it explains the cycling, but also the metaphor for building as well. You can build things very quickly by yourself, but you don't want to be that single point of failure, and you need different people to build with you in order to build something that's longer and lasting.
Nick, I read once your story about buying your first apartment in Berlin, and all the thoughts that you had back then. How you know you had you had fears like everyone else, because it's basically a big decision. But looking back at what you've built after this, it looks so simple, so easy to use. So for you, the decision on buying property, or I don't know, investing in some real estate, it's probably like comparing to someone else buying a coffee. So could you walk us through how difficult it is to buy an apartment in Germany?
Sure. So I think back when I bought my first apartment, I believe it was 2015. So I was at Ada Health and I'd gotten a pay raise. I wasn't even out of probation yet. And I thought, hey, I'm living in this tiny flat. I think I was 40 square meters. I'm saving a lot of money every month. I have some savings. I actually had an insurance payout that I got from getting hit by a car as a cyclist that ended up being my down payment, or the largest part of my down payment. And so that's actually funny, because as one door closes, another opens. and this literally led me to the whole home buying aspect of my journey. So back then, this was 2016, I believe, there was no English resource. So I'm Dutch, and back then my German was really mediocre, I would say. Of course, we can read and understand the majority of it, but there was no kind of resource, and even the German resources that were out there were impossible to decipher. So there was no easy way to understand, or like it was a maze. And so literally my journey was, I hopped on a bike, even if I remember correctly, it was even with my dad, and I told him, hey, I want to buy something because, you know, this is the background that I came from, which was also in the US, where home buying is it's a much more common tradition. And I'd seen my parents fix and flip houses when I was younger, also with other families in Georgetown, where we grew up. And I always heard the stories of how much sense it made. And I grew up with a lot of economics around me, economists as well, living in DC and going to an international school where the majority of our parents went to the World Bank or the IMF. So economics was always very central to our thinking, and we grew up um, with that education. And it was obviously it wasn't very difficult to convince my dad that it made sense. And he jumped on the bike with me, and my idea was, hey, let's just bike around and see if we can go from building tower to building tower. So these cranes that you see, above the new build, because it's not like at the time there was a very easy way to find new builds. But I was sure that I wanted a new build because I didn't want to have to deal with an existing property with the renovations and modernizations. So that was my first intuition. The second was going for new build and looking for cranes and biking around. And then I stumbled upon some projects that were not listed on Immobilien Scout, which did exist at the time. And then the process was all very old fashioned. I went on Immo Scout, I filled in my lead info, and then I believe 5 different guys were calling me from Berliner Sparkasse and this and that and sending me emails. And I was like, what is going on here? And I had absolutely no idea what I could afford, but I assumed that, based on, 30%, 40% rule of my income, I could manage to buy this apartment based on some basic math. But a lot of things that we take for granted now, so to say, like, hey, what can I afford, or what were the purchase fees, or like, what are the purchase fees in Berlin? That was not there. So I had no idea about what the notary fee was. There was a real estate agent involved, what the taxes were. So I kind of went into this whole decision rather blind. And what was the worst part of all was that the mortgage broker, so to say, the one who actually managed to get me on the phone and offered to come to my office at Ada to walk me through the contractual mortgage offers, he was absolutely useless. Like, he had no financial education. So any question that I asked about, does it make sense to put down more equity, less equity? Should I fix for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? It was always the same kind of cookie cutter, basic, oh yeah, interest rates are low because they used to be higher. Kind of, oh, you should fix long because low risk. Oh, you should, repay fast because high risk after 10 years. Yeah. So it was like this very basic, rudimentary things. And to be honest, like, uh, it was, I in the end had to just use my own intuition, because there was too many missing details that I couldn't recreate like an actual model to calculate it. And throughout the whole process, I then realized, okay, it's very intransparent. I have a guy coming to my office. I have to meet him at physical places to sign documents. I have to print everything. And I was working at Ada Health, where we were solving, complex problems with an app. And I started seeing parallels between, what a doctor does, which is, identifying symptoms and understanding the relationship between symptoms and a diagnosis or disease, I started seeing, okay, there are certain inputs that lead to a certain financial output. And so very much this is something that we ended up, me and my dad were in Malta biking again, which was a common theme. We basically thought, hey, like, you know, is there such thing as a financial doctor? Is there somebody who can listen to your symptoms and actually give you objective advice? And that was, in the end, how this idea was born, was very much, again, it's identifying a problem, being unhappy with the current status quo and the solution, and then trying to build something better and having the conviction that once you understand the problem in its entirety, that there are ways to, you know, stair step improve the efficiency, productivity, and ultimately, you know, build a business out of it. And I didn't understand whether there was a business because I didn't understand how this mortgage broker was getting paid, because it was all just a black box. And only by stumbling upon it in the loan contract did it become clear that this guy was earning 2% of a 450K loan. And did I start thinking, okay, you know, for 10 hours of hand holding, no proper advice, letting me basically pushing paper from one side to another. Is this something that can be disrupted? And that's when I, you know, got that idea of, hey, there's a market here, there's a problem. Can we do this better? I think we can. Let me research it. And so that's when I was starting this research phase when I was still working at Ada, and kind of deep into the nights understanding the problems. And to be fair, we actually started building something that was in the complete wrong direction, complete different direction of where we are now. We went into this hyper over engineered product where we thought, you know, customers would want to refinance completely online themselves. And so we started with a product which basically used the interest rate curves to predict whether it makes sense to refinance now or not. And it used some technical tax implications from buying real estate in Germany to give customers a calculation whether they should refinance now, they should get a forward mortgage, or wait till the end of their fixed interest term. And so we built this fancy calculator, and it was actually cool to build, but we forgot one key aspect, which was the human, which is that especially in Germany, most people don't want to refinance their mortgage without talking to someone. And so we built this fancy, you know, product, which I think could maybe become relevant in a little while eventually. But we started with a great marketing approach. We could easily sign up customers. They loved calculating what they could save, but then they would just go to their house bank, or they would use this calculation as information. So there was actually no real business behind it, because we at the time were not a mortgage broker. We were just doing lead generation for mortgage brokers, essentially. We didn't have the proper license. So for us, it was a hugely intransparent space that we had to, you know, basically imagine getting a torch and walking through the dark and trying to light the way through a dark forest and not hit your head walking into to trees and tripping over roots everywhere. That's a little bit what it felt like. So we were discovering lots of different things, and once we understood the whole problem, could we start building models for it? And you know, it's like, in a way, it's like a doctor. Like, only if you understand the anatomy of a human and how everything relates holistically with one another can you actually give proper health advice. It's not like you start just studying, you know, the leg, and then you never think about the rest of the body. So that was a little bit how we felt that we were slowly starting to understand how the whole problem um, um, was yeah.
This is like fascinating story, and when I talk to most of my friends, most of these things are obvious to you, but it always starts with a simple uh, belief or leap forward. Can
Yeah.
I can I afford it? So already,
Yeah.
you tackling this problem, you have this
Yeah.
wonderful mortgage calculator, but then the next questions we have is, okay, I can afford it, but what is going
Yeah.
to happen next?
Yeah.
I don't know, I might marry somebody, or I might
Yeah.
get divorced, or I might, whatever. Like all this uncertainty, they embed it in our heads.
Mm-hmm.
And um, I would love to ask you how like this global economics might impacting decisions and generally, what is happening along the way, because you also
Yeah.
mentioned that COVID hit hit the whole industry so hard that many people didn't even survive because of that, because we 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 always think in our bubbles, but above that there's this huge world that we don't think of, and
Yeah.
it always affects us. And by the way, before we delve into this topic, I think your dad was either macroeconomist or something related to
Yeah.
that. So how much of his advice made a kind of conscious impact on your decisions?
Yeah. So I think what you touched upon is quite interesting. And that's something that I always remind myself is you don't know what you don't know. And so being rather humble and curious is a great way to approach life. Um, and that's, I feel, how I very much live my life. It's very focused on learning and understanding how this whole complex structure in the world kind of hangs together, whether it's, ideology of people or the whole economy, and then you have all these microcosms within these complex structures, which you can then infer behavior from this to that. So you have the world, and you have Germany, then you have Berlin, and then within Berlin you have, obviously that's dependent on Germany, which is dependent on the world, but then you have things that you might not immediately see. And I think one thing that was interesting with your last question, which I didn't touch upon, was it all seems so easy. And that's true in hindsight. And I think a great metaphor is like when you're zoomed in on a line chart, you don't really know if this is a local maxima or minima until you zoom out. And you're on a curve and you don't know how steep the curve is until you zoom out. And I feel like this is very much how I intuitively approached buying this flat. I followed my instinct at the time, which was, okay, how competitive is Berlin compared to Germany, Germany compared to the world, interest rates relative to historic interest rates. And I used, in rather simple terms, like a framework to understand, um, uh, to make a decision around this. And obviously, this was just intuition at the time, and I didn't understand all the intricacies of and all the implications of mortgages and finance. But at the time, this felt like the framework that gave me the confidence to say, okay, I feel like there's a lot of hiring going on. Zalando wants to hire 2,000 engineers in the next 2 years. Okay, that probably sounds like a buy signal. Yeah. Oh, okay. This company is locating to Berlin. Oh, they're starting an office in Berlin. And so my hypothesis at the time was very much built around job growth. And because job growth leads to demand, and demand leads to um, higher prices. And so I was rather bullish on Berlin as a whole. And that's when um, and at the time I made up a lot of that decision without kind of consciously involving Chris. But obviously I have that framework built in place because I grew up in the US, in DC, where, you know, most of our parents were working for these international organizations. So it was always a topic, and you subconsciously observe, but also absorb a lot of this knowledge. And I actually never wanted to become an economist. So because my dad was on that path, I was very sure I did not want to go down that path. So I was the rebel, and I was like, okay, I don't like school. I'm great at sports. I'm always, you know, I'm different. So I went down my path, but then, funnily enough, our paths in the end crossed through a bit of a detour. And yeah, now we're in the end working still together. And even my brother was also working with us, and um, he's again different. He's much more technical and analytical than me. I'm much more on the customer facing side, and my brother is a data scientist. But we can talk together about the same topics, but at a certain point, I cannot follow him and my dad when it comes to the abstract math and abstract econometrics topics, because typically my attention span is not there. And what's interesting is that I have much more of an 80-20 approach, whereas, for example, Chris and my brother Sebastian, they need to drill things down to a very black and white, you know, decimal. And whereas I'm like, intuitively, it makes a lot of sense. And, you know, I can always fall back on a lot of that reasoning, and I see it. So back to your question of like, how much of a role did that play? It's interesting because we had a big discussion when we started the company where I told him, hey, like, building a B2C player in the mortgage space, and I had, you know, I knew a lot about the B2C space because of Ada, and through the fundraising talks, I understood, you know, from the investors, hey, how are you going to get to 100 million users? I understood growth, I understood product. I really, I synthesized the same kind of models every time. And I told Chris, I was like, listen, like, it's going to be very much about product and growth. Like, how are we going to build a great product? And then how are we going to market it? Because in the end, it's a very competitive space. And this is, to this day, it's a bit of a point of contention of how important is marketing versus how important is, you know, the financial modeling in itself. And this is maybe a bit of of our egos bouncing off of each other. But I think it's, in the end, what we've realized, we really need a great product that's built on, you know, great financial advice and modeling. So that's kind of buried very deep inside the product. So for example, like we have something that we call a optimal mortgage, and basically it's a recommendation engine. And Chris always has these crazy ideas, and I then have crazy ideas on the customer side, and then we have our third co-founder, Pavel, who is really the executor, and he actually makes it happen. So he's a bridge between, and he's an engineer and he's our CTO, but he's the one who really is able to realize these crazy problems. So for example, you know, we've built our own, and by we I mean him. He has built a way to translate our Excel models into code, which, you know, it took us, when we started, it took us, you know, weeks to build these Excel models, and they're huge. You know, how do you, like, when you're modeling future interest rates, and, you know, you have like sheets like with the ECB rates, you have the spot rates, the forward curve, etc. And then you have all these sheets, and then you have to do all this computational stuff in Excel to then kind of say, what kind of mortgage do you need? Like, do you need a 10, 15, or 20? And then we have to take these complex Excel sheets and turn them into code because we wanted to build this recommendation tool online. And at the beginning, we just had to like actually code it. But then eventually we realized, hey, we're using so many Excel sheets and we've built so many calculators by now. We need to find a way to export for or transform a sheet into code. And these are kind of the things that you don't see behind the scenes, but that's the stuff that really makes a huge difference. And so in terms of engineering problems, I'm always like the face of the company, but it's really these two guys who are solving the hard problem.
Well, Nick, by being outside of your ideation cycle, and also coming from engineering world, I must give you credit for some stuff that unintentionally appear, and they actually addressing huge challenge in terms of basically thinking. So when you built and when you released pension friend, you instantly address the fear for the future, because like I've mentioned, like I'm thinking, am I able to even afford that, and what is going to happen along the way? But then when you release this pension friend, and there was a few posts and they were super clear about, guys, if you think consciously about your future, and if you're gonna enter the pension time, so retirement time, without a property, you are likely to fall into this basically
Pension gap.
yeah, the gap of being arm like
Armored, yeah.
yeah.
Alter's armored.
It's basically like, we don't think about that, like no matter how much of engineering skills you have, it's like you're thinking ahead of and this is what I love, like you've created like ecosystem for thinking consciously about your financial independence. And I really, like just basically, without like going into further details, but it's a big credit to you and to the team that you've able to do it. And my question I have, and maybe like a simple question, what is actually this thing, like you mentioned at the beginning, equity release? So I'm buying a property for 10, so I'm selecting this 10 years period when I have to pay off my credit. But after 10 years, I still remain with some chunk of this credit, right?
Yeah.
So what happens then? Like what happens after this 10 years of like you paid it off? What options do we have as a buyer?
So maybe to go back to giving credit, I think that credit rightly should go to the team. So I think what you and most people see and hear and read is what I synthesize. So I take a lot of our big ideas and research, and I try to storytell them and break them down to very simple terms. And I think that's where Chris and I are very complementary, is that we both look at the world in similar ways, but then, for example, this pension, the way that we look at this is you have three building blocks, essentially. You have your own home, you have a buy-to-let property, so an investment property, and then you have your pension or ETF portfolio. And they're each an individual foundation, or pillar, so to say. And, you can focus heavily on one and less on the other. But we believe, and, we have the math, we've done the math and the research to back it up, that each one plays a critical part in this, what we call a sound financial future. So a future where you don't have to worry about your retirement. For some, it's at 60, for some, it's at 70. But these are the building blocks we say to build upon. and they're the best products in Germany to build upon. You have lots of other products like a company pension plan, which is what I would avoid at all costs because it's a high cost product, and any tax benefit or most tax benefits are basically eaten up by the fees that these insurance companies like Allianz are charging. So these are the things to avoid. So you have these building blocks, and a lot of people now with pension fund are saying, well, you guys are building this because you want to make money. At least that's some of the comments I've read. But in all reality, it's we're not building this to make money. We're building this because we see a problem and a gap in the market. And this gap is actually the pension gap. The pension gap is a huge problem for Germany. You have an aging population, which, is no longer able to be supported by the working population. That ratio from working to aging is slowly but surely, getting less and less. So you have too many elderly and not supported by enough workers or employees who need to contribute for the generation. So this is just it's a train wreck that's about to happen. You see it, you can see it from maybe it's not 5 years ahead, maybe it's 10 years ahead, maybe it's 20 years ahead, but the basic economics of this problem are just no longer holding up. So there need to be changes, and the changes we see are either the life expect the retirement age has to increase, which you see and you're slowly observing in different European countries like France. But I believe with every 10 years, the retirement age has to increase by 1 year. So if you're 30 and it's currently 67, and you retire, let's say at 70, that's 4 years. Yeah, so that's 4 decades, is 4 more years. So that's 67 plus 4 is 71. Yeah, so that's kind of the rationale that we're looking at. So back to your original question of the first pillar, the own use property. You also have the buy-to-let property, so to say, the investment property. So the difference is fundamental. Firstly, in both cases, you have a remaining loan balance that's outstanding. And let's say you buy it for 500, you borrow 500, and then after 10 years, there's 350 left. What happens to 350? Well, if you have a 10-year mortgage, it means you have to refinance to a new contract. So a new contract means you have to renegotiate with the bank based on the currently outstanding loan amount, the 350, and the new property value. And so the new property value might be 700. So the renegotiate rate is based on the loan to value of 50%. The 350 over 700 is 50%. So you will have a better mortgage, but this is assuming that the interest rates are similar and not, at a much higher point. And so what we do, and what actually every bank does, is they stress test the remaining loan balance. They refinance it at, for example, 8%. They say, okay, can Sergey, in 10 years, can he carry an increased interest rate to 8%? And this is one of the main reasons why the default rate in Germany is relatively low compared to the world. They don't like risk. And the second is that neither do banks, and these stress tests are preventing people from borrowing too much. And what happens at the end of this 10 years is the difference in it being your own home versus it being an investment property is that if it's your own home, you're not just going to sell it, right? So it's much less likely that you can just sell it quickly to, if from a financial perspective, it doesn't make sense to hold on to, which is usually not the case. But with a buy-to-let or investment property, it's much easier to decide, hey, okay, I want to sell it at the 700 and pay off the 350K that's remaining and take my 350K profit, so to say. And the benefit of it being after 10 years is that you don't pay capital gains on a investment property, which means that you've basically, you've you've gained 350 in equity.
But this is assuming that the price of the your property was also growing, right? And
Exactly, yeah.
but like I think we've been in Berlin, we've seen this crazy
Yeah,
growth. So pretty much everything that you've invested in the past gave you a positive results.
yeah.
And looking at all the global economics numbers, do you
Mhm.
believe that Berlin is still going to be on a steady growth? I'm not expecting basically hockey sticks, but is it still financially safe to buy new builds like you did back in the days?
Yeah, so this is a complex question because it's basically about making a prediction about the future based on A, the past, and B, what we see now, and how what we've seen in the past has led to what we see now. So to answer that question, you have to break it down into, I think, the essence of it, which is, will there be more demand than supply going forward? And that's a question that you have to look at both sides of the demand and the supply. So, and obviously, where they meet is price, right? So, if demand is less than supply, prices drop until there's a new equilibrium. And this is maybe economics 101, but it's important to remember because you want to look at what's on the demand side of the equation versus the supply side. And so what determines demand? Well, of course, you want to look at, you mentioned Berlin. So Berlin is relative to Germany. So the first thing I would look at is how does Berlin compare on an aggregate level to the nation? And so when you look at that, you look at what we call GDP, gross domestic product. So the total product, total value of product and services within the economy. And in this case, so Germany, as we've all seen in Bloomberg and the different publications, is the sick man of Europe. And so what they're referring to is it's the one country in Europe that's not growing. It's still, I believe, the third biggest economy in the world, right in front of Japan since recently. And so what I'm going after is how does Berlin relate to that? And if you look at the last 5 years, you see that Berlin has consistently been outperforming, so to say, the Germany as a whole. So Berlin is growing faster. And what does that mean? Well, it's producing more than Germany on average is producing. So if you take that argument, there are two things you can derive from that. Well, the first is that more foreigners will likely come to Berlin, and then within Germany, it's likely that higher growth will lead to higher job wage growth. And you have this kind of magnet effect, which is a strong economy attracts intelligent workers because they can simply pay more. And so within Germany, you have to look at what is the relationship between Berlin and Germany, and then what is the relationship between Germany and the rest of the world. So not to make it too long-winded of an answer, I think German, Berlin-based companies are doing relatively well. GDP, I think growth in 2022 was on the order of 4.5%, so quite high, especially when Germany was on the order of 1%. Then you have another other topics like, okay, the number of refugees, what is the percentage of refugees that might return versus what is the number of people who might immigrate to Berlin. These numbers are all positive so far. So Berlin population is growing. So then the question is on the demand side, are they building faster than the necessary homes that are that need to be required or are required by the population? And to be honest, I think the goal is to build 20,000 homes a year. And if there's anything that's certain, is that Berlin consistently falls short of that because it's very difficult to build. During the COVID crisis, we saw building materials shoot up like crazy. So things like timber, wood, all kinds of basic requirements for building became much more expensive. And this led to a lot of what we see now, which is several big project developers that have gone bankrupt. What had happened is they basically sold their projects and then they promised, hey, we're going to complete it in 2024. But then what they forgot is that both labor and materials have increased on the order of, I don't know, some things I saw like 10 to 30, 40%. And then if your margin on the property is, 5 to 10%, I don't know, I'm just guessing here, but then you have a problem. So you've basically promised to complete buildings that you can't afford to complete. And this is what we saw happen recently. And I think now inflation is coming back down overall, but you still have elevated prices, and this is also what you see in the property prices. New builds are not really dropping in price because, first of all, the build is very expensive, and they're just waiting to for the market to so-called catch up. And so you're not seeing like price discounts very much on from the larger new build developers. They are trying to squeeze their margins, so they're decreasing their margins, if anything, but they're not really trying to make huge discounts.
Well, if I summarize what I've heard from you, because there was some optimism and pessimism also delivered, but generally the message is that we still ought to grow. We still ought to grow. Berlin seems to be still economically strong, so there is nothing predicts that there is going to be like a property prices collapse. So likely the decision towards buying makes sense.
So I think that question in itself is a loaded question, because whether buying makes sense is not only a function of property appreciation. So, because, for example, you have the reason why it's a loaded question is because you have to also take into account what is the alternative to that. So rents in Berlin have increased by 10, 15% in the last year. So if your rents are constantly increasing, the cost of rents are increasing. At a certain point, buying, even if it's even at increased prices, it's going to be more affordable to buy than it is to rent. And what I was saying is, like, it's an equilibrium. So you need to look at the price in the middle. And so on the supply side, you don't see much building happening. On the demand side, you see rents increasing, and at a certain point, rents will spill over to buying because it just makes more sense from a financial perspective to buy than to rent. And obviously that equation is also driven by the cost of borrowing, the cost of buying, which is primarily the interest rate.
Well, Nick, I want to zoom in the future and just to also, like, imagine we are at the pension age. And when you were telling me this, basically demographic shifts with constantly aging population, I try to basically assume the fact that I'm not going to get a pension at all. But I have two kids, and I would love to see basically and model their future. And if to compensate for a pension, we need to constantly increase the taxation for the labor class. At some point, it's economically unfeasible for them to work. Like, why would they work and they have to pay more than 50% on taxes? They would just, I don't know, try to be better off with, I don't know, some social support from the government. What is your view on that? Or let me put it on the other side. We have some examples of heavily or progressively elderly population like Japan. What can we learn from Japan history?
So I mean, again, it's an interesting question because it touches upon lots of different elements. Um, so I think the first thing we have to look at is taxation, right? So Germany has a so-called progressive taxation. So the more you earn, the more you're taxed. However, I believe at 250,000, it's capped. So it's unlike other countries, you don't have as many steps. And so I think, as you mentioned, so if we have a larger aging demographic, there are two things that can happen. The first is taxation, the other is productivity. Because if you produce more, you can still tax the same, but you'll still generate more tax income for the aging population, right? To offset the contributions into the pension. So that's always an important thing to look at, which is what is the productivity growth of a country. And one of the more worrying things is that before COVID, the US and Germany were more or less on par when it came to productivity. But since COVID, Germany has seen a decline, not a decline, but has seen a disconnect between the US. So you kind of see this plateauing of German productivity, whereas the US has this continuous productivity. And so this disconnect is what I would say is rather alarming, because with an aging population.
Sorry, and where is it coming from? How do we describe productivity? Is that because like there is a constant strikes every week, and we simply, don't add value, or like
That's a
please
good question.
educate me why the productivity falls?
That is a very good question. So I mean, for one, it can be based on the productivity of a country is dependent on its workers, but it's also on things like adoption of technology and adoption of so a very simple one is Germany had, I believe, one among the highest sick days last year of most countries. So you have a workforce that is often sick, and that is obviously creating a drag on productivity and a drag on output. And so the output per person, if you look at a very aggregate, whatever that output may be, just declines if people are sick, or if they're not motivated to work, or if they're in between jobs. So I think that's one thing that is a little bit worrying, is how do you navigate these problems? So how do you navigate an aging population, lower productivity, and then already high taxation? And in my view, the logical answer is you have to shift taxation, but you have to shift it to a class, and in this case, not to sound social, like too far on the as a socialist, but you have to shift it to the ones that are benefiting from the productivity increase, because it's not the worker themselves that's benefiting from the productivity. It's rather the owners. And when you look at technology and a little bit this George Orwell view of the world, where you have, maybe it's not George, maybe this is a futuristic world where you have AI, and you have people controlling AI, and you have the workers and the platform, and you have this clear divide between who is benefiting. So let's say you have the Elon Musk of the world, who are controlling a disproportionate, and I mean a heavy disproportionate amount of the value, but at the same time are not paying the taxes that are required to have the economy and the population run. I think this is where you need to start looking in terms of how do we get the population how do we motivate the population in a way that doesn't disincentivize the top too much from simply moving out of the country. So, let's say you're one of the rich families in Germany, that's whatever, the Aldi family, or this classic manufacturing wealth that's distributed mostly in the south and of Germany. How do you create jobs? How do you make sure that the jobs remain competitive, that it's not over-regulated with unions, but at the same time people have rights? How do you make sure that people are still contributing to their pension, but at the same time that the platform owners, so to say, or the wealthy are still paying enough taxes to support um, the country as a whole? So I think this is a very tricky balancing act. And this is, where you have the simple answer. Well, let's say the oversimplification of this is that you have, the left and the right, who then one says raise the taxes, the other says tax the rich. But it's a very tricky problem because you need to find the right tax amount to, if you're a government, you want to maximize your tax amount, assuming that the government can return that tax amount in an efficient way to support the economy and its population. So that's a more kind of theoretical and ideological discussion as well, which is how much government intervention do you need, how much of a social aspect versus a purely capitalistic aspect do you employ, and that's a discussion you can talk for hours about.
Yeah.
And there's no
Well,
right or wrong, in my opinion.
well, yeah, I know we're short on time, and
Yeah.
I only have a few more minutes with you, but there are two things I would love to still uh, ask you, and this is really connected to what you just mentioned. How do we make sure that Nick Mulder stays in Berlin, creates in Berlin, builds jobs in Berlin, and attracts other Nicks out of other places?
Holland.
Because I believe, I think seriously, like thanks to people like you and like-minded people, uh, there is progress. There is actually what you describe as the incentive to add value, create jobs, be massively increase productivity of economy. What made you, or like, is there anything that you believe is a risk of you migrating back to Holland or US? How can the government retain Nick here?
Well, the good news is that the government has forced a taxation for leaving. So I'm stuck in Germany. Um, there's actually an exit tax, which is taxing your assets if you were to leave Germany as your main primary residence. So I'm here to stay. But that being said, I think there are also ways around those kind of problems. But um, I think it's a difficult question because different things motivate different people, and I do think what builders have in common is a culture where they feel like they can build and building is appreciated. Um, and I think this is one of the problems that we have in Germany is a culture where failure isn't necessarily celebrated, where failure, is seen as a failure as opposed to as a learning. And so I think, you have the cultural aspect, then you have, of course, the taxation, the legal aspect of how easy is it to build, how easy is it to start a company, how easy is it to hire. I can tell you it's not particularly easy to start a company. It's not particularly easy to employ people and to keep them employed, and a number of let's say just the things you don't even think about when you start a company, right? Because when I started building HepoFriend, I didn't think it would actually amount to something. Of course, in an Excel sheet, you say, oh, we have 200 people working here at some point. But like the disconnect between reality and Excel and these models is always quite quite substantial. So yeah, I think it's a multiple. It depends a lot on the people. I mean, I personally am in Berlin because I love I've built so many friendships and friends here also in the social um, in the social space, that I think Berlin has, an amazing, in terms of music, in terms of uh, dynamic people, artistic, fashion, you name it. It's a very thriving um, social space, and I think that's different from Amsterdam or Paris, where you see a lot more,
Nick,
commercialization.
to loop our discussion to, like, holistic story, how we've started. I would love to basically just learn, what is your, like, sporty daily routine? And I'm asking this because I've commented on your body. You were in South Africa, and you look damn sporty. You're in a super shape. Obviously, the background of your professional athlete pays off, but to be sane in being entrepreneur and handle all of these problems that you mentioned, how do you structure your day?
I'm not going to give you the answer that I wake up at 5 a.m. because that would be an absolute lie. I usually, I mean, I think health is wealth. So there's nothing more important to me than being healthy. And as mentioned earlier, I have a genuine interest in health, sports, and now longevity as well. So nutrition, sleep, wearing a Whoop, of course. Again, I'm curious about, as I said before, you don't know what you don't know. And I think there's a lot that we simply don't know yet. So I have a lot of interest in, which probably stem from this athletic career, which is, kind of self-optimization in a way. So I think that's something that you don't really ever give up on. So I don't think I live a very different life than most. I have a dog, and that requires me to go outside a lot. I think sunlight early in the morning is one of the most important things. I don't eat until about 1 or 2 p.m. So it's 2:30 now, and I'm looking forward for breakfast, lunch. So I do fast every day. So I eat usually between 2 and 8 p.m. Because I'm a big believer in intermittent fasting. Um, I do still bike sometimes, but most of my sports are around running and gym or calisthenics. So I prefer, you know, um, agility and strength over pure muscle mass. So I think there's a, a trade-off between, building too much muscle and not being able to do enough cardio. So I think and I think there's also on the other side of that is doing too much cardio and having no muscle mass. So I've been on both sides, and I like to find a balance now. So in the middle, and that's usually going to gym, running 3-4 times a week. And I think the beauty of being an entrepreneur and being your own boss is that you have the freedom to do that whenever you want. Of course, I have my meetings, but I give is a big word here, but I like to be free, and I want people in my company to also have this feeling that they can be free, that they're not, working to live, but or what's the saying, living to work or working to live. Um, so I think it's quite important that that we remember, like, what's important in life, as I said before, like enjoying the journey. So after this, I will probably go get lunch and then sign off at around 4, and then go to the gym and enjoy maybe a little bit of sun. So I think the beauty of having bootstrapped this company is that at a certain point you do have freedom, and whether that's financial or time based, I think that's one of the major trade-offs that you make as a venture backed company, because there's always the next hoop that you have to jump through. And I think with our company, we can really set the cadence of innovation. So we can say, hey, okay, I was just I was traveling now for 5 weeks, where most of the time I was offline. 80% of the time I was offline. So there's definitely, I think that's really a true luxury, and I'm super grateful to have that. And obviously, I don't want to come across as I really enjoy building as well. So I think it's finding this 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 cadence of working hard, enjoying life. I don't have children, and I don't have um, I'm not settled down in that regard. So I still have a lot of freedom, and I think that's something also that's worth a lot. But there people watching this are probably in different phases and stages of their life, and I think what's important is small changes for your health that are important. So the most important for me is no sugar, for example, and then no caffeine after 3 p.m., for example. You don't want to compromise on your sleep. These are the small changes that are compounding over life, so over 30, 40 years, that are critical. So I'm trying to focus on the small changes that have a very big impact. So sleeping is the absolute cornerstone of everything. So 8 hours and very deep sleep, as if possible.
Well, Nick, I love your routine, and I truly encourage many of us also to to adopt this. Make small changes that compounds that lead to greater version of themselves.
Yeah.
I'm going to probably come and bounce you in one of the calisthenic spots. I do it frequently
Cool.
during the summertime. So right now, like after work, I'm gonna go and check in at Montbijou,
Nice.
my favorite spot. And so Nick, it was great pleasure hosting you and sharing all this valuable information. I'm going to post in the description both links to Pension Friend, to the Hyper Friend, and also I encourage you guys to check out the Telegram bot, especially for those of you that would love to rent. It gives you instant, a light speed approach to finding something without chasing links on different apartments. And I'm only looking forward to what else you're going to build, because I've already mentioned to you the crazy speed of innovation that your company is providing is just amazing. And I looking forward to see more.
We have something coming up. I've been since coming back from vacation, I feel like I've been really invigorated with a new passion again. So I think that's really important to find that balance of going on vacation, recharging your batteries, coming back, and that's really important. Something I've in the first 4 years of building the company, by the way, I never did. So that's a good learning as well. So enjoy. I hope people enjoyed the podcast, and thanks for hosting me. I really appreciate it, and maybe see you in Bonjibu.
Alrighty.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Have a good
And
one. Thanks a
see you
lot.
next time.
See you. Bye bye. Thanks.